Hello, everyone. On behalf of my brothers and my mother, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today to celebrate my father's long and full life. It is said that this type of thing, whether it be a funeral or a celebration of life, is for those who are left behind. And the most important person in that respect is my mother. As many of you know, my mother is in the late stages of Alzheimer's. We could be sad about this, or we can choose to look at it in a way that my father lived long enough so that my mother didn't have to feel the emotional pain of losing him. She's at a stage where she's happy about everything because she cannot remember anything to be sad about. Their great love affair actually ends in the perfect way. At the end of our celebration today, there is a slideshow that will show many of the things that my father did in his life. But I want to be perfectly clear that the greatest achievement was the relationship that he had with my mother. After my brother Ben posted about my father on Facebook on the day that my father died, you could see the comments and how many mentioned specifically this wonderful marriage that they had. Our first slideshow is about their 65-year love affair. The song backing the slideshow has a story in itself. I want to tell you the story of this song and how it has come to mean so much more. When my brother Ben and his husband Nate came to Canada this past summer, Nate pulled me aside and asked me if I was doing okay. I said I was okay, and he repeated the question like he didn't believe my answer. I know he asked this question out of love, as he knew that I had taken on the burden of my father's last months. What Nate didn't know was that those last few months before my father died, my father gave me a great gift. And for the last few months, my father and I had a whole different relationship than we had ever had before. It all started about a year and a half before my father passed away, when in August 2021, my wife Janet and I took my parents to Toronto to attend a celebration of life for my Uncle Ed, my father's identical twin brother, who had died in February of that year. The overwhelming thing that I took away from that event was how much both of these men had accomplished in their lives. I thought about what it was that drove them to always reach beyond what others thought were normal limits. Driving back to Ottawa, I started to think about my own life. I had just turned 58, and I wondered about how many years I had left on this earth, and what I wanted to do and what I hadn't done. I decided then that I was going to quit my job and start my own design firm. I also thought a little bit longer, and I asked myself, what else do I want from life? I said to myself, I want to sing in a Broadway musical. Now I have your attention. Once back at home, I enacted both plans almost immediately. I quit my job and I started my own design firm. The second goal had one unanswered question. I needed to find out if I could actually sing. I had never sung in public or really in front of anybody ever. I also knew that I would get extremely nervous talking, let alone singing, to any group more than about 10 people. I kept things very quiet and I didn't tell anybody what I was doing, not even my wife. I looked online for a teacher and found Naomi, an operatic soprano with experience teaching musical theater voice. She listened to my voice and soon recommended that I try a song from the 1960 Broadway musical Camelot. It was called If Ever I Would Leave You. I had never heard this song before. At the time, without giving anything away, I inconspicuously asked my father if he had ever heard this song. He then actually sang it in its entirety, word for word. I told him at the time that I thought it was kind of a dumb song. For a guy who supposedly loves this woman so much, he spends an awful lot of time figuring out when he's going to leave, I thought. My father explained that this song is sung by Lancelot, who is in love with Guinevere and must leave because he is going off to fight in the Crusades and will most likely die. He loves her, but he knows that he must leave. About a year after all this, two things happened. My father announced that he wanted to live long enough to see his 95th birthday on November 30th. He told the doctor that he would be in to see her in the first week of December to start the procedures for MAID, medical assistance in dying. To be clear, this was the third time that he had tentatively set a date. The second thing that happened right around the same time is that Naomi, my singing teacher, told her students that she had accepted a position with the opera in Berlin and would be going to Germany for 5 years. She was planning to have a recital for all of her students on November 25th. I was going to have to sing in front of people, a lot of people. Needless to say, I think I had become comfortable in my secret life. Then it hit me. If my father never found out about this, he would go to his grave none the wiser. But then I thought about how much regret would I have to live with for the rest of my life if I didn't let him in. Of all of his loves, singing was right at the top. I decided I had to let him in. So on November 25th, I told my parents that I was taking them to a concert. On the way, I told them that I was going to be the one that was singing that night. My father turned to me and asked, "You sing?" There were about 20 students performing that evening. When it was my turn, I went up on stage. My legs were shaking, my stomach was turning. Obviously, there were more than 10 people in the audience. I sang "If Ever I Would Leave You." Somehow I got through it. I took them back to their residence, and I helped my father across the slippery parking lot and into the lobby. I started to say my goodbyes, and my father said, "Well, I think that was the best birthday present I've received in my entire life." Needless to say, I was blown away, but as time went on, that feeling grew stronger. I didn't go into this looking for anything, but because I put myself out there, so much came to me. My father lived another 3.5 months, where, as I said, he and I had a different relationship than we'd ever had before. He suggested songs that I should try. He gave me sheet music, gave me all kinds of pointers. He was excited. About a month after the recital, one day in their apartment, my father started to sing the song, "If Ever I Would Leave You." He motioned for me to join in, and I did. I looked over at my mother, and she had closed her eyes and was mouthing the words, as she always did, as she still does. As we sang together, I realized that my father was a man that was in love with this woman and was having to decide when to leave. This was a 65-year love affair. It never waned. As we go through the slideshow, just look at the expression on my mother's face. It says it all.
If ever I would leave you, it wouldn't be in summer. Seeing you in summer, I never would go. Your hair streaked with sunlight, your lips red as flame, your face with a luster that puts gold to shame. But if I'd ever leave you, how could it be in autumn? How I'd leave in autumn, I never would know. I've seen how you sparkle when fall nips the air. I know you in autumn, and I must be there. And could I leave you running merrily through the snow, or on a wintry evening when you catch the fire's glow? If ever I would leave you, how could it be in springtime, knowing how in spring I'm bewitched by you so? springtime, summer, winter, or fall. No, never could I leave you at all.
I hope you enjoyed that. My favorite is the video where they're cutting the anniversary cake at Chemong, our family cottage. It is such a perfect moment in time. Also, probably fitting that there was no audio because I think I remember that there was a dirty joke involved. Um, you'll see many pictures shown today that were taken at Chemong. My mother took my father there for the first time in the summer of 1958, and they've created so many memories over the years. Chemong is shared by my mother and her two brothers, Rod and Bob. In 2016, Bob announced that he and Dorothy were going to be selling their house in Toronto and would be moving to the house that they had just bought right next door to Chemong. What a life that they've made for themselves. We're all jealous. I've asked Bob to say a few words, and maybe a little more if we're lucky, as the representative of the family that my father married into.
Hi, I'm Bob McCullough. Ann Rutherford is my sister, and today I'm saying a few words on behalf of the immediate McCullough family. I was in my early teens when John came on the scene, and this was clearly much to Ann's delight. To the Dulwich and traditional McCullough clan, John was a character, and one who never stopped exploring throughout his entire life. This observation of the explorer mindset sort of started with John and Ann's honeymoon in Egypt, and then beyond, leading to several more trips when they were living in the UK. When they returned to Canada, these trips then became travelogues that John choreographed and delivered at the Heliconian Club in Yorkville. Fast forward to his taking early retirement at age 56, he launched himself into opportunities like security guard at a theater so he could spend time inspecting the sets, building a staggering 78 RPM record and recording machine collection, tackling complex, not just complicated jigsaw puzzles to pass time at the family cottage, diving into the world of tissue paper collage in his early 90s, where he engaged us innocents by having us start a picture so he could challenge himself to finish it off. Looking at the piece I started for him, he said, "Oh, I never use those colors. So this will be a real challenge." At the family cottage, John sang opera alone in the gazebo. He acquired 400 feet of extension cord so he could run his boom box and play CDs so he could sing along to without bothering or being bothered by anybody. His 30,000 plus record collection was astounding, largely collected from Saturday morning garage sales. At those garage sales, he also acquired countless paintings, each for $1. And very often that was just to get the frame, which was worth more than the artwork. He was Scarborough's first poet laureate, which triggered Toronto and Ottawa to jump on the bandwagon quickly to get their own. He was perfect, playing the role of the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, in full regalia. He inaugurated the Speakers Bureau of the Canadian Opera Company, giving pre-performance talks about the upcoming opera for well over 20 years. In the fall of 2008, he even gave a talk prior to the performance of a rather obscure opera at the Teatro del Naggio Musicale in Florence, when John, Ann, and my immediate family spent a month there at an olive grove farm just outside of Florence. John had a scurrilous story to share whenever we met. Often it came across to me as an odd conspiracy theory, one of those many of you will remember as the real story behind The Wizard of Oz and the stage of life of heroine Dorothy. While we'll not delve into the story here, we will remember it through the most famous song from the film. The one thing that showed up more visibly later on in Anne and John's relationship was John's absolute devotion to Anne. And we know that Anne loved and respected him more than anyone else in the world. And for that, the McCullough family is so grateful. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Bob, for that wonderful presentation. I remember so many family events and parties where once the majority of the guests had left, Bob stuck around and played the piano while my father was doing dishes and singing from the kitchen. The second slideshow is about the relationship that my father had with his three sons. Today we celebrate a life well lived and we act happy that he had a great life. But I don't want to let go of the sadness either. I will miss him terribly. I had the honor of being there for my father in his last weeks and days and hours. As he was going down, a particular song came into my life. The song is called Monsters by James Blunt. I only hope that I can pass on to you the same emotion that I had the first time that I heard this song.
Oh, for they turn off all the lights. I won't read you your wrongs or your rights. Time is gone, and oh, I tell you good night, close the door. I tell you I love you once more. Time is gone, so here it is. I'm not your son, you're not my father. We're just two grown men saying goodbye. No need to forgive, no need to forget. I know your mistakes and you know mine. While you're sleeping, I'll try to make you proud. So Daddy, won't you just close your eyes? Don't be afraid, it's my turn to chase the monsters away. Sleep a lifetime, yes, and breathe the last word. You can feel my hand on your own, 'cause I'm not your son, you're not my father. We're just two grown men saying goodbye. No need to forgive, no need to forget. I know your mistakes and you know mine. While you're sleeping, I'll try to make you proud. So Daddy, won't you just close your eyes? Don't be afraid, it's my turn to chase the monsters away.
To everybody out there, as I mentioned before, my father had an identical twin brother, my Uncle Ed. Both men had three sons. My Uncle Ed and Auntie Barbara named their first son John. And because my father's name was John, my cousin John has lived his entire life with the moniker John Jr. So everybody knew who you were talking about. It wasn't just a name that they shared, but a love of art and music and records and singing. There was a bond there that transcended the typical uncle-nephew relationship. When my father died, I called my brothers first, then Auntie Barbara, and then John Jr. I've asked John to say a few words and a song as he is a very accomplished blues guitarist, singer-songwriter. Hey, John, how are you?
I'm so well, Tim, and it's just a lovely tribute and lovely. You're doing a wonderful job
Thank you.
today. This is lovely. I just want to say hello to everybody and say that I'm so happy to be here with all of you. It's heartwarming to be part of this gathering of friends and family, and to be with people who loved my Uncle John. I first want to say hello and send my love to Auntie Anne, my Auntie Anne, and my three Rutherford cousins, Michael, Tim, and Ben. And as Tim so kindly introduced me, I am once again reminded that the distinction of sharing the same name as my uncle has been a source of fascination to me throughout my life. And I feel that same sense of pride and wonder today. From my very earliest moments, I can recall so many wonderful memories, and maybe as one that goes back as far as I can really remember. I recall going to the house at Markham Road for family visits, and I remember one day being in the basement playing. I might have been 3 or 4 years old, and playing in the basement with Michael and Tim may have been around at that time. And I think I either bumped my head or Michael pulled my hair, or I got poked in the eye somehow or something. And I ran upstairs in a panic, crying. I came tearing around the corner into the living room where the adults were sitting and visiting. And I leapt up onto what I thought was my father's lap, but it was in fact my father's twin brother, my Uncle John. And I leapt into his lap for comfort and for care. And as I realized that I had, you know, sought that attention from somebody other than my father, it was a brief moment of panic for me. But I still recall that he consoled me and held me, and that I was comfortable in his arms, and that he was a second person that I could go to, and for that comfort. So that was one of my earliest memories. I remember later as a teenager and some family gatherings in our backyard, and me arriving with I might have been 16 or 17, and arriving with one of my very first girlfriends. And Uncle John was fascinated and had lots to tell me about what was in store and what what he thought I should be doing. So I remember his advice and his guidance at that stage in my life. And then I moved to Calgary when I was probably in my very early 20s, and a whole new kind of relationship started with my Uncle John. And that was that every single time I came back to Toronto, I scheduled a visit with him. And my parents knew that that was important to me. And when I'd come to Toronto, that meeting would be set up. And those meetings were often me going over to number 39 Markham Road, and we would go down in the basement, and often Auntie Anne would be working at the library or off doing something. And John would take me into the basement, and he would show me how the records were organized and what was there, and he'd let me have at her and search for records that I would like to have in my collection. And the rule was that I would take everything I kind of found interesting and put them into a pile, and then he would go through them and take out anything that was that he needed to keep, and then he would just give me the rest of them. And so I have hundreds of records, hundreds of 78s and albums and 45s and all sorts of interesting, odd recording industry paraphernalia that my Uncle John has given me through the years. Some of them you can see over my shoulder in my record collection. This is 78s right here that many of them, most of them, came from Uncle John's collection. And the last time that I saw him at my father's memorial or celebration of life, he gave me a wonderful box of records and jazz and blues records that he had pulled out of the collection specifically for me. And they included some what would be considered elite and just jewels for any collector of jazz and blues 78s, records by Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, just fascinating stuff from my perspective. So we forged a relationship and a kind of a communication and
a love that really was for me just so exceptional and special, and has meant something to me my entire life. And all of the gifts that my uncle gave me over the years, I can remember some fascinating ones. Most of them he would have made himself. Many of them he made himself. He gave me a huge African shield that he had created and painted and put a handle on the back, and it was sort of part toy, part artwork, and that hung in my bedroom wall for many, many years. He also gave me a complete kit for silk screening. That was one of my birthday gifts that I remember very well. But a gift that I thought I'd show you that I think is fascinating is that Uncle John went to Russia very early on in my time, probably about 1958 or 59. I'm guessing he had made a trip to Russia, and it was unusual to travel to Russia at that time. And when he returned, the Toronto Telegram, the newspapers in Toronto, were interested in his story, and the Toronto Telegram had done a piece on his travels to Russia. And when he returned from Russia, he brought me a gift, and it's this toy, which is a toy of the Kremlin Towers. And I still have it to this day, 60 some years later, and treasure it dearly. But it's a toy that you pull apart as a child's kind of toy of beads and stacking things. It's just a lovely piece at this point in time. And then also, just of interest, as I said, the Toronto Telegram did a piece on his trip, and one of the photographs that was included in the newspaper article was a picture of me holding on to the toy. So I have both the toy and the picture as incredibly warm and glorious memories of my Uncle John. I think that in many ways, Tim, is sort of what I wanted to kind of project and sort of explain, that this relationship, it was interesting that we have the same name. And I think that did have a lot to do with the connection. That's my feeling. But the connection certainly transcended the name, and we've just been it was fascinating to have this relationship throughout my life. And he would phone me on my birthdays, and I would make sure I stayed in touch with him. And after my dad passed away, just sort of 2.5 years prior to Uncle John passing, I really felt this sense of having kind of a backup. And Uncle John, like he did when I ran up the stairs and flailed myself onto his lap for him to console me, he stepped up in the very much the same way when my dad passed away, and I stayed in very, very close touch with him during that 2.5 years, and it was very, very comforting for me to be able to have that. So that's kind of what I wanted to project today.
And so when I introduced you, I mentioned that you are an accomplished blues guitarist, singer, songwriter, and we have something for everybody today. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
You bet. You bet.
It's very special.
Yeah, we're going to play a song from a recording of mine that was released more than 10 years ago now. And the song has a kind of an interesting connection to Uncle John. It was actually written about a very close friend of mine, a fellow guitarist, musician, who I met when we were quite young. And after we met, his career started to really flourish, and he became very, very famous. And his name is Jeff Healy. And Jeff was a close friend of mine, and we worked together a great deal. I was very fortunate to play guitar with him literally dozens or maybe hundreds of times. We collected records together. When he came to Calgary, we would always go out and look for records, and I would be his sort of eyes as we went through the bins of records, and he would always be pulling out fascinating things and teaching me about records. And at one point, I said to Jeff Healy, while we were collecting records and talking about 78s, I said, "You really must meet my uncle. He is one of the biggest 78 collectors in the country, and has something like 70,000 78s in his collection. And Jeff was really startled. And he said, well, of course, we were in Calgary. And he said, well, can we go and visit him? And I said, no, no, no. I said, my uncle lives in Toronto. And Jeff said, he sort of paused and tilted his head, and he said, oh, you mean John Rutherford? And we chuckled, and of course he already knew my uncle. He'd known my uncle since he was about 15 years old, and had been collecting records and getting records from my uncle's collection, from Uncle John's collection, and was a part of the CAPS, the Canadian Phonograph Society's group, and would go to the meetings, and he knew my uncle well. So he said, oh, you mean John Rutherford? And I said, yes, that's my uncle. He lives there. He said, oh, he's crazy. And I said, oh, yeah, he's crazy brilliant. And he said, he sure is. And so we had this really fascinating kind of connection with through Jeff Healey. You know, Jeff was a friend of my Uncle John Rutherford, and he was a friend of mine. And so when Jeff, I would come back to Toronto, and Uncle John was not the only appointment or trip that was essential for me to make happen when I got to Toronto. I also would go and visit with Jeff Healey, as he always did when he came to Calgary. And so when Jeff Healey passed away, it struck me as a very poignant moment when I flew back to Toronto to visit my parents and realized that Jeff was not there, and how that changed everything in terms of going to visit Toronto. And so that same sentiment is echoed in losing my uncle. And it really does feel like when I go to Toronto, it's not quite the same place. So this song was really written for Jeff Healey, but it couldn't have been more appropriate for my wonderful Uncle John.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, John. We're going to go to the video.
Thanks, everybody.
And listen to the song many times. Just each time, I can feel it, all that emotion, and I listen to it over and over again. It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Bye now.
Bye now.
This town seems familiar, but it's just not the same. Since you've been gone, they went and changed the name. The signs on the outskirts and on Old City Hall. Streets and the boulevards aren't what they were called. Now it's Blue Town. I find myself lost, and I'm lost and alone, here in a town I used to call home. The skies have been gray and it feels like rain. Without you here, things just aren't the same, here in Blue Town. Just round the corner, memories of you. Address number 1 Lonely Avenue. Well, it seems familiar, but it's not the same. Since you've been gone, they went and changed the name to Blue Town.
something that honored the relationship that my father had with his 4 grandchildren, but was at a loss as to what to do. As I searched boxes and photos in preparing for today's celebration, I realized that I had forgotten all about my father's laptop. There were about 15 years of his photos and videos since he got his first digital camera. As I looked for photos to fill in the other slideshows, I stumbled across a video that I'd never seen before. He took it of himself singing a song in the kitchen in Scarborough in 2013. I watched and listened, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The song is called Absent, and it was made famous by my father's favorite singer, Paul Robeson. And it actually is telling about how one goes on in life when a special person is gone.
Sometimes between long shadows on the grass, the little truant waves of sunlight pass. My eyes go dim with tenderness the while. Thinking I see thee, thinking I see thee smile. And when the moonbeams seem to drift apart, and tall trees whisper heart to heart. From my parted lips the eager answers fall. Thinking I hear thee, thinking I hear thee call.
I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank Bob and John Jr. again for making this a very special event. I want to thank my 2 brothers for coming up with all the extra photos. My wife Janet, always my editor. And finally, I want to thank my mother. The words don't mean anything anymore, but she was always the one whose words brought me back to center. We're ending our celebration of my father's life with the final slideshow. It's all about just some of the achievements in my father's long life. A 34-year teaching career and a 39-year retirement that truly amounted to a second full career. Just like the other slideshows, this one is backed up with a song. A few weeks before my father died, my parents and I were in the lounge watching the weekly singing show put on by the 2 in-house hairdressers. We watched for a bit, and they asked if anyone wanted to sing something, and my father nudged me to go up. After the previous 3 months we had together, how could I say no? I walked up to the front, and I realized that something had changed. I mentioned before about the gift that my father gave me. This was it. My legs weren't shaking, my stomach wasn't turning, and there were way more than 10 people in that room. As I hadn't prepared anything, I had to pick a song where I knew all the words. That said, whenever I hear this song, I always think about my father. I went back to my parents, and my father, with a big grin on his face, said, "You can sing that at my funeral." So technically, this is today's only request. Before we start our slideshow, I have to warn everybody that there is an audible gunshot sound. Yes, we don't want anyone to be surprised, but once you see it, you'll have to agree it's perfect. As I mentioned before, this slideshow will end our celebration. I hope it made you happy, and I hope it made you sad, and I hope it inspired you in some way. Thank you for celebrating with us today.
And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear, I'll state my case, of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway, and more, much more than this, I did it my way. Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do and saw it through without exemption. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, and more, much more than this, I did it my way. Yes, there were times, I'm sure you knew, when I bit off more than I could chew, and through it all, when there was doubt, I ate it up and spit it out. I faced it all, and I stood tall and did it my way. I've loved, I've laughed and cried, I've had my fill, my share of losing, and now, as tears subside, I find it all so amusing to think I did all that, and may I say, not in a shy way, oh no, not me, I did it my way. For what is a man? What has he got? If not himself, then he has not to say the things he truly feels, and not the words of one who kneels. The record shows I took the blows and did it my Yes, it was my